Hello, this is Cory Endrulat, and welcome to learning about the history of natural law. As we would say the word natural law, there's many different types of what we can call the natural law. We're going to get pretty specific, go over some of the definitions, and if you really look at all these different perspectives, because that's the whole point of looking at all the many people who have talked about it, I will also share with you many resources for yourself to learn upon this in the modern day and age, with our improved understanding of this concept. So, without further ado, let's get into the complete history of natural law. I even created a timeline for all the many people who have put so much work and effort into this subject matter. And natural law is also considered natural rights, moral law, cause and effect, the golden rule, law of attraction, the science of justice, God's law, the law of reason or conscience, and common sense. This is of the 2020s, and I appreciate you being here and watching. If you decide to watch in full, that's great, because then perhaps you can have a fuller understanding of how this has delved differently and moved more innovatively over time into this concept that we still now consider natural law. So our modernized definition of natural law is, quote, a set of universal, inherent, objective, non-man-made, eternal and immutable conditions which govern the consequences of behaviors of beings with the capacity for understanding the difference between harmful and non-harmful behavior. The understanding of natural law is centered upon bringing our own conscience into alignment with objective morality. This means knowing definitively what behaviors are rights because they do not cause harm to other sentient beings, and which behaviors are wrongs because they do cause harm to other sentient beings. Human belief is completely irrelevant when it comes to the existence and operation of natural law, just as it is irrelevant in relation to any of the other laws of nature, such as gravity, inertia, momentum, thermodynamics, or electromagnetism. Similar to such other phenomena of nature, the workings of natural law require no belief in order for them to be discovered and known. This, as you come to understand it over time, and especially within your own life, you may see it as the most powerful information you'll ever come across. So without further ado, let's start with the origins of how we found this word and this concept. What does it mean to all the philosophers of the past? Well, there's a lot of biblical ties to this, Greek ties, Roman ties, old cultural origins all over the world. We see it in Stoicism, we see it in Taoism. It may include philosophers, and sorry if I can't always pronounce their names correctly, but Heraclitus, and I'm probably going to say a lot of these wrong, Sophocles, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Philo, Judaeus, Lucius, Annaeus, Seneca, and more than that, but that's just some names to name based on everything else that I talked about. Now, Philo agrees with the philosophers as to the limited sense in which enacted human law may be regarded as natural law, but argues that a law revealed by God, who is the creator of the world, as to Philo the law of Moses was, is fully in harmony with the laws of nature, which God himself has implanted in the world for its governance. Cicero wrote in his De Legibus that both justice and law originate from what nature has given to humanity, from what the human mind embraces, from the function of humanity, and from what serves to unite humanity. For Cicero, natural law obliges us to contribute to the general good of the larger society. Also in this writing he states, quote, there is indeed a law, right reason, which is in accordance with nature, existing in all, unchangeable, eternal, commanding us to do what is right, forbidding us to do what is wrong. It has dominion over good men, but possesses no influence over bad ones. No other law can be substituted for it, no part of it can be taken away, nor can it be abrogated altogether. Neither the people or the Senate can absolve from it. It is not one thing at Rome and another thing at Athens, one thing today and another thing tomorrow, but it is eternal and immutable for all nations and for all time. Sophocles' play, titled Antigone, seems to confirm the superiority of natural law over positive or man-made law. Antigone states, quote, nor did I think your orders were so strong that you, a mortal man, could overrun the gods' unwritten and unfailing laws. Nor now, nor yesterday's, they always live, and no one knows their origin in time. So not through fear of any man's proud spirit would I be likely to neglect these laws, draw on myself the god's sure punishment. Karma, perhaps? The conflict and struggle between Creon and Antigone is an indication of the conflict that exists in the higher moral law, natural law. On one hand, the man-made law, on the other hand. Antiphon states, quote, "We regard those who are the children of noble fathers and respect them. We neither respect nor respect those who do not come from a noble family. In our relations with each other, we thus act like barbarians. However, whether Greek or barbarian in nature, we are all created to be the same in everything. Obeying the mandatory laws of nature applies to everyone. Likewise, all this can be achieved by anyone, and in none of these things can one of us be distinguished from the other, as Greek or barbarian. We all breathe with our mouth and nose, we all eat with our hands." For Plato, an object or action is good if it reflects something of the form of the good, a metaphysical essence which we somehow know through reason. Goodness comes from something fulfilling its form, its nature. This also applies to human beings. A person who fulfills human nature is good, and one who falls short is evil, either naturally or, if by choice, morally. Against the conventionalism that the distinction between nature and custom could engender, Socrates in his philosophic errors, Plato and Aristotle, posited the existence of natural justice or natural right. Universal law is the law of nature, for there really is, as everyone to some extent divines, a natural justice and injustice that is binding on all men, even on those who have no association or covenant with each other. That's a quote. Heraclitus stated, quote, "All human laws are sustained by the one divine law. Among this, he points out that man sees the laws of the universe. His duty is to learn and obey them. He must follow the truth of nature, which is infallible, because it is the divine law of nature." You can see already they're using different terms to describe natural law. Divine law is one of them. Eternal law is another one. So the problem with every form of government since their foundation is their belief in the ruling class having this divine right to rule, thus believing they are superhuman in their nature, that they have rights that their subjects or slaves do not. Even at the time, people were catching on to natural law and the fact that they are born with the same rights as everyone else. However much their vision was outruled or kept hidden by man's law and government, the entity of which the very existence depends on the removal of the knowledge of natural law and the monopoly of violence to suppress dissent. People then also create justifications for different forms of government on top of the natural law present, since it was all ever their conditioning since birth, the only life they knew to exist. So if we move along this timeline, we see Paul the Apostle, we see Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Tertullian, Gregory of Nyssa, Augustine of Hippo, and Gratian. Paul the Apostle stated that the natural law defines and identifies which actions are reasonable and worth pursuing, evidence that God has implanted in man a moral order or of moral goods that acts of reason can discover. Epictetus stated, quote, "No man is free who is not a master of himself," and, quote, "Only the educated are free." Marcus Aurelius stated that there is a natural law to which even positive man-made laws have to conform at the price of becoming unjust laws. Augustine of Hippo stated natural law is, quote, an uninstilled law written on the human heart or conscience, and, quote, "No one injures another without at the same time hoping the same will not be done to himself, and in this respect he transgresses the law of nature. The very fact that he does not want to suffer the fate he inflicts on someone else means that he cannot plead ignorance of the natural law." What Gratian was doing with natural law was to take a concept that existed in Roman law and in ancient philosophy and give it a new spin, by declaring that natural law equals God's will, and that natural law, like God's will, is unchanging. You can also look up all these quotes for yourself from different sources and from these people's own writings. For Gregory of Nyssa also, natural law was originally engraved within human nature, and he also says that it was restored to nature by the incarnation. By natural law, Tertullian means both the order of the universe and the moral bonds that unite all men, as well as man's natural capacity to know them. Moving on here, we see Anselm of Laon, Ibn Rushd, Albertus Magnus, Henry de Bracton, Thomas Aquinas, Matertia School in Tisla, Dante Alighieri, Duns Scotus, and John Fortescue. Anselm of Laon stated, quote, "The natural law is this: what you do not want done to you, do not do to another." Ibn Rushd maintained that we could also perceive natural laws as the agents that dictate events in the world around us. For instance, if paper burns when touched by fire, it is not because God willed it, but because natural law dictates that fire to burn paper. Ibn Rushd argued that one must understand the natural law to understand the universe. Albertus Magnus places God as the pinnacle of justice and natural law. Thomas Aquinas stated, quote, "This is the first precept of the law, that good is to be done and promoted, and evil is to be avoided. All other precepts of the natural law are based on this." In Maturity, quote, "Ethics have an objective existence, and humans are capable of recognizing it through reason." In Is Tisla, bears some similarities to the natural law tradition in the West, as exemplified by Thomas Aquinas. However, this is a method that's used, is Tisla, the way of teaching, whereas natural law deems good that which is known self-evidently to be good, according as it tends toward the fulfillment of the person. Is Tisla calls good whatever is connected to one of the 5 basic goods, as it calls it. Al-Ghazali abstracted these basic goods from the 5 legal precepts in the Quran and Sunnah, which is religion, life, reason, lineage or offspring, and property. It's very interesting they mention property here. Dante Alighieri offers an allegorical presentation of justice and uses the image of 3 women to characterize 3 kinds of justice, namely what medieval authors called natural law, or driteria, which is ius naturale in Latin, the law of nations, ius gentium, and civil law, ius civile. According to Dante, these kinds of ius are deeply connected, as ius naturale is the mother of ius gentium and the grandmother of ius civile. Henry de Bracton, an English judge and scholar from the 13th century, wrote that a court's allegiance to the law and to God is above its allegiance to any ruler or lawmaker. Duns Scotus stated, quote, "The nature appealed to by classical and medieval theories of natural law, however it might have been conceived by any particular thinker, was invariably associated with 2 criteria. It represented an authoritative standard with determinate content that was understood as both universal, that is, not prescriptive for just one individual, and accessible to human beings through their natural powers. Because natural law rests on a nature that cannot be changed by human action, it has universal validity. Because human beings themselves belong to that nature, they are in principle capable of knowing the corresponding law." John Fortescue stated that laws that violate natural law precepts are invalid and unenforceable. We can also see Pelagianism and Brahman law as well when we look at natural law. Pelagianism states that nature actualizes the law in the heart through the testimony of conscience, or that the conscience bears witness that it possesses the law by fearing when sin is committed and by rejoicing when sin has been overcome, even if he who sins should fear no man. By nature they do the things that belong to the law. The Brahman laws ensured that the uses of the land were sustainable, which is why we can learn so much from this wise system of natural law today as we struggle to come to grips with the massive environmental and social degradation witnessed today. Within this system, it reflects a type of law that is universal and may be determined by reason and observation of natural action, although it is natural law not strictly defined. And we'll notice that a lot with the use of this term in old times. Now, we see natural law also being taught within the school of Salamanca. And there were many different teachers in this school. Some include Francisco de Victoria, Martin de Azpilcueta, Domenico de Soto, Thomas de Mercado, and Francisco Soares. The school of Salamanca taught much about natural law morality through these teachers. Quote, the school of Salamanca reformulated the concept of natural law originating in nature itself, with all that exists in the natural order sharing in this law. Their conclusion was, given that all humans share the same nature, that they also share the same rights to life and liberty. Such views constituted a novelty in European thought and went counter to those then predominant in Spain and Europe, that people indigenous to the Americas had no such rights. They held that, quote, men are born free by their nature, and not as slaves of another man, and can disobey even to the point of deposing an unjust government. So then we also see Edward Coke, Alberto Gentili, Richard Hooker, Francis Bacon, Johannes Althusius, Hugo Grotius, John Selden, Thomas Hobbes, the Age of Enlightenment as a whole, Sir Matthew Hale, Richard Cumberland, Samuel von Pufendorf, John Locke, Gershom Carmichael, Montesquieu. Many people within the Age of Enlightenment spoke of natural law. Its revival sparked a great amount of focus on morality and natural rights, to creating more freedom for the world and in creating a country's independence. There would be too many people involved to mention, honestly. Edward Coke stated that natural law is, quote, written within the finger of God and in the heart of man, and it existed before any judicial or common or municipal civil law. In other words, he also stated that, quote, the law of nature is that which God at the time of creation of the nature of man infused into his heart for his preservation and direction, and this is lex aeterna, the moral law, also called the law of nature. Hugo Grotius championed a natural law philosophy which derived from the higher law doctrine of Cicero and other ancient Roman and Greek philosophers that we mentioned before. They believed the legitimacy of government laws must be judged by the standards of justice, natural law. Grotius defended natural law without appealing to the Bible or organized religion. He insisted it followed from the nature of things and it was discovered by human reason. Natural law, Grotius maintained, is the basis of natural rights. Quote, civilians call a faculty that right which every man has to his own. This right comprehends the power that we have ourselves over ourselves, which is called liberty. It likewise comprehends property. Grotius, like many also before him and during his time, didn't follow the logic of natural law all the way, as he still accepted slavery, even though this obviously violated the natural principle that individuals own themselves. Grotius didn't see all the radical implications of natural rights in that degree. Thomas Hobbes stated, quote, a law of nature is a precept or general rule, found out by reason, by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life, or which takes away the means of preserving the same. For though they that speak of this subject use to confound jus and lex, right and law, yet they ought to be distinguished, because right consists in liberty to do or forbear, whereas law binds to one of them, so that law and right differ as much as obligation and liberty. End quote. He also speaks upon the fear of freedom due to the possibility of chaos, although nowadays this may be understood in the fact chaos is a teacher, and that in order to obtain true freedom we cannot fear, and we shall promote the knowledge of morality under natural law, as fear through violence and slavery done in the name of authority, as we see with the number one cause of unnatural death, democide, is chaos. Richard Hooker speaks of inclinations to continue in being through offspring, to act like God according to a certain exactness and order, and unlike the animals, to exercise virtue and know truth for their own sake. Johannes Althusius stated that the natural law teaches persons higher ideas that appeal uniquely to human reason and conscience. By them, a man understands what justice is, and is impelled by this hidden natural instinct to do what is just and to avoid what is unjust. Through the natural law, God commands all persons to live a life that is at once pious and holy, just and proper. God teaches them the natural duties of love that are to be performed toward God and one's neighbor. He sets out the basic rules of living, obeying, and administering that must govern all persons and associations. He sets forth general principles of goodness and equity, evil and sinfulness that every man must know in order to live with himself and with others. He teaches the actions and omissions that are appropriate to maintaining the public good of human society, as well as the private good of households and families. Montesquieu calls laws of nature the result of the nature of each being, where nature is defined as one's frame in existence, the kind of thing that one is. In the case of man, these laws are discovered by thinking about man in his state before the existence of society, i.e., in the state of nature. He states that there are laws of nature rooted in the constitution of our being, and as Hobbes have suggested, quote, to know them, one must consider the situation of the individual before the establishment of societies. The laws of nature are those which he would receive in such a state. But he insists such a man would not be instinctively aggressive, as Hobbes contended. Francis Bacon stated, quote, nature to be commanded must first be obeyed. Sir Matthew Hale, in his Law of Nature, describes conscience as that which persuades a person of the divine obligation of the natural law and applies the natural law to particular circumstances. Richard Cumberland states that there is a law of nature, defined as a proposition of unchangeable truth and certainty, which lays firm obligations upon all outward acts of behaving, even in a state of nature, where observation of the world, including man's nature, demonstrates the truth of this law, and all other moral precepts are applications of the law of nature to particular forms of human action. Samuel von Pufendorf states the natural law does not extend beyond the limits of this life and merely regulates only external acts. He also challenges the Hobbesian thesis of a state of nature which is a state of war or conflict. For Pufendorf, too, there is a state of nature, but it is a state of peace. John Locke stated, quote, man has a natural freedom, since all that share in the same common nature, faculties and powers, are in nature equal, and ought to partake in the same common rights and privileges, and that, quote, the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind, who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Of which, quote, the natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth, and not to be under the authority of man, but only to have the law of nature for his rule. Gershom Carmichael states that no man has the right to enslave another, quote, for men are not among the objects which God has allowed the human race to enjoy dominion over. Now moving along this timeline, we see Francis Hutcheson, François-Marie Ariet, otherwise known as Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Bourlamarque, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, James Wilson, Jeremy Bentham, who also opposed this sort of idea because he thought it would promote disobedience to authority. U.S. founding fathers in the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, of the Citizen, that's in France, Frederick Bastiat, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Lysander Spooner, who had a very deep understanding of natural law, and many historians don't always consider his perspective. He wrote about natural law being the science of justice. The end of physical slavery we saw at the turn of the 19th century here. And Theosophy. We also notice Henry David Thoreau. We notice then, because of Henry David Thoreau and people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, we saw Transcendentalism having these ideas, as well as Otto von Guericke. James Wilson argued in his philosophical writings that the ordinary person has the capacity to be virtuous and just by means of an innate capacity to know the natural law, and he defended the revolution principle, which is known as popular sovereignty, for that reason. Voltaire had advocacy of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and separation of church and state, speaking of natural law. He stated that humans are not deterministic machines of matter and motion, and free will thus exists. But humans are also natural beings, governed by inexorable natural laws, and his ethics anchored right action in a self that possessed the natural light of reason eminently. Jean-Jacques Rousseau stated, quote, "The wise man requires no law." Hutcheson helped open the door to a political and social philosophy that emphasized the role and importance of human reason in mastering the nature of man and the world in which he lives, and reinforcing a justification of human freedom based on natural rights. Quote, "The natural equality of man consists chiefly in this, that these natural rights belong equally to all. The laws of God and nature prohibit the greatest and wisest of mankind to inflict any misery on the meanest or to deprive them of any of their natural rights." Immanuel Kant stated, quote, "The first principle of morality is, therefore, act according to a maxim which can, at the same time, be valid as universal law. Any maxim which does not so qualify is contrary to morality," and has a big focus on ethics and morality in relation to natural law, making it moreover clear that what is right and what is wrong is wrong. There is no gray area. Human beings are obligated to follow this imperative unconditionally if they are declaimed to be moral. And that was sort of what he was hinting at. Jean-Jacques Burlamac stated, quote, "My design is to inquire into these rules, which nature alone prescribes to man, in order to conduct him safely to the end, which everyone has, and indeed ought to have, in view, namely, true and solid happiness. The system or assemblage of these rules, considered as so many laws imposed by God on man, is generally distinguished by the name of natural law. This science includes the most important principles of morality, jurisprudence, and politics. That is, whatever is most interesting in respect as well to man as to society. There can be nothing, therefore, more deserving of the application of a rational being, of a being that has its perfection and felicity seriously at heart. A just knowledge of the maxims we ought to follow in the course of life is the principal object of wisdom, and virtue consists in putting them constantly in practice without being ever diverted from so noble a pursuit." He has much on this in his work. As with others, people devoted to this subject conducted many writings and lectures to the public and social positions in society. The U.S. Declaration of Independence states, quote, "When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Upon further examination with our knowledge of natural law in modern times, we can see the mentioning of property being left out of the text, thus not making clear the matter of natural rights and ownership under natural law. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen from France begins with, quote, "Human beings are born and remain free and equal in rights," being influenced by the U.S. Declaration. Also stating, quote, "These rights are liberty, property, safety, and resistance against oppression." Frederick Bastiat states, quote, "Each of us has a natural right from God to defend his person, his liberty, and his property." Also stating that, quote, "Life, faculties, production, in other words, individuality, liberty, property, this is man. And in spite of the cunning of artful political leaders, These three gifts from God precede all human legislation and are superior to it. Henry David Thoreau held many freedom-promoting views connected to nature and theorized about further improvements, quote, toward recognizing and organizing the rights of man. Ralph Waldo Emerson spoke of many types of laws within nature, as he even states, quote, everything in nature goes by law and not by luck. And when talking about man's law, he states, quote, the highest virtue is always against the law, as every actual state is corrupt. Transcendentalism as a whole may speak often of these higher laws and the importance of questioning authority in relation to connecting with nature. Lysander Spooner, who had a very deep understanding of natural law, he advocated it wherein acts of initiatory coercion against individuals and their property, including taxation, were considered criminal because they were immoral, while the so-called criminal acts that violated only man-made arbitrary legislation were not necessarily criminal. He also used natural law as above the government and its documents and as a primary argument against all forms of slavery, including the existence of government. He stated, quote, what then is legislation? It is an assumption by one man, or a body of men, of absolute irresponsible dominion over all other men whom they can subject to their power. It is the assumption by one man, or a body of men, to subject all other men to their will and service. It is the assumption by one man, or a body of men, of a right to abolish outright all the natural rights, all the natural liberty of other men, to make all other men their slaves, to arbitrarily dictate to all other men what they may and may not do, what they may and may not have, what they may and may not be. It is, in short, the assumption of a right to banish the principle of human rights, the principle of justice itself, from off the earth, and set up their own personal will, pleasure, and interest in its place. All this and nothing less is involved in the very idea that there can be any such thing as human legislation that is obligatory upon those upon whom it is imposed. His views shatter the natural law views of others who still maintain their statist belief in the existence of government. He states, quote, government is in reality established by the few, and these few assume the consent of all the rest without any consent being actually given. He uses many examples to prove these points based on common sense, otherwise known as conscience. As a real anarchist by definition and an abolitionist, he helped in the riddance of the most prevalent form of slavery at the time. Theosophy holds that no religion is higher than the truth, and many different philosophers associated with such may speak of spirituality, principles, karma, and more in relation to natural law. Ivan Ilin stated, quote, natural law as a necessary form of spiritual being is the most precious possession of humanity. Outside of this form there is no path either to wisdom, to virtue, to divinity, or to the ultimate and highest satisfactions of spirit. Every diminution of natural law degrades human worth. Each violation of it is spiritually contrary to nature. Therefore, it is essential to guard and to uphold it against those who violate it and don't recognize it. It is essential to protect it, affirming it through collective, organized recognition, proclamation, and realization. Moving along the timeline, we see Alfred Adler, Carl Jung and his views on morality, Jacques Maritain, Heinrich Riemann, Clive Staples Lewis, and Manly Palmer Hall. Alfred Adler stated, quote, there is a law that man should love his neighbor as himself. In a few hundred years, it should be as natural to mankind as breathing or the upright gait. But if he does not learn it, he must perish. Manly P. Hall spoke that occultists teach that the universe is governed by intelligence, love, and law, and the greatest of these is law. Love and intelligence serves law, ornamenting it and beautifying it, and law serves all things impartially. Millions of intelligence make manifest the intricacies of natural law. All things flourish when they abide in law. All things perish when they disregard law or seek to break its eternal power. One can assist natural law by understanding the law, and then by putting it into application. By living accordance to nature and her plan, he may eliminate nearly all of the inharmony which claims the ignorant. Tomorrow is molded by today. Buddha said, "Effects follow causes, as the wheels of a cart follow the feet of the oxen." Next to evolution in importance is the law of cause and effect. The brain is the vehicle of the mind and gives to those who use it control over the invisible forces of nature, because the mind of the magician has learned to know and obey the laws which govern all forces in nature. Heinrich Raumann states, quote, "Man must, and ought to, thus, both will and achieve the perfecting or fulfillment of the potentialities of his being which God has put into his nature. An extensive treatment of moral problems from the standpoint of the natural law or rational ethics often leaves the impression that ethics as a branch of philosophy is quite sufficient to lead a man to perfection and happiness, individual and social." Jacques Maritain was a strong defender of a natural law ethics. He viewed ethical norms as being rooted in human nature. For Maritain, the natural law is known primarily not through philosophical argument and demonstration, but rather through connaturality. Connatural knowledge is a kind of knowledge by acquaintance. We know the natural law through our direct acquaintance with it in our human experience. Of central importance is Maritain's argument that natural rights are rooted in natural law. C.S. Lewis, known also for the Chronicles of Narnia, stated, quote, "The Tao, which others may call natural law or traditional morality, or the first principles of practical reason, or the first platitudes, is not one among a series of possible systems of value. It is the sole source of all value judgments. If it is rejected, all value is rejected." He also states, quote, "To see through the natural law is the same as not seeing at all." Even Tolkien, known for The Lord of the Rings, is known for saying, quote, "My political opinions lean more and more to anarchy, philosophically understood, meaning the abolition of control, not whiskered men with bombs, and that, quote, the most improper job of any man, even saints, who at any rate were at least unwilling to take it on, is bossing other men. Not one in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity." He hoped patriotism would remain a habit, but that it would not do any good if it isn't universal, thus all relating to the worldwide application of natural law. We also see among the timeline Ayn Rand and objectivism. Ayn Rand stated, quote, "Rights are a moral concept, the concept that provides a logical transition from the principles guiding an individual's actions to the principles guiding his relationship with others. The concept that preserves and protects individual morality in a social context. The link between the moral code of a man and the legal code of a society, between ethics and politics. Individual rights are the means of subordinating society to moral law." She also states, quote, "The reason each individual's life should legally belong to him is that each individual's life does in fact morally belong to him." As by objectivism, natural law is moral standards that govern human behavior, objectively derived from the nature of human beings and the nature of the world. Then we also see, as we move on over time, we saw some influences with the type of speaking about laws of nature and National Socialist ideology influences. It spoke of a natural law, yet forcibly and unnaturally was trying to harmonize with it in regards to race, where natural law can also, be used against their own ideology for crimes against humanity and the natural law violations of statism. And this is common among all sorts of modern ideologies that is used to appeal to people. However, to observe this appeal to nature upon a population, quote, "When man attempts to rebel against the iron logic of nature, he comes into struggle with the principles to which he himself owes his existence as a man, and so his actions against nature must lead to his own doom. Here we encounter the objection that man's role is to overcome nature. But man has never yet conquered nature in anything. but at most has caught hold of and tried to lift one corner or another of her immense gigantic veil of eternal riddles and secrets, that in reality he invents nothing but only discovers everything, that he does not dominate nature, but has only risen on the basis of his knowledge of various laws and secrets to be lord over those other living creatures who lack this knowledge. This lacking of knowledge can be referred to as occultism, what keeps the hierarchical power dynamic in government in place in separating society into the ruling class versus non-ruling class. And so we can observe in the evolution of natural law from what we've seen so far that natural law was declining in popularity and warped by the authoritative influencing ideologies of social Darwinism, moral relativism, eugenics, and self-determination. That wasn't the case with everybody that we saw, but it was becoming the case in this time of the century in the 1900s. It was confused with the so-called law of the jungle, the so-called natural order. Any human-made law in any aspect of an animal with less capabilities than human beings. And people still have these assumptions to this day. As people were unable to obtain and discern the true knowledge of natural law, that was the case for them coming up with these assumptions. Those justifying other forms of law still recognized that there indeed existed an underlying law, being natural law. However, their understanding of this law would not be expected to be fully known at their time, as the information age is now upon us in the 21st century, and we may reflect upon all history and cultures to know the full nature of natural law or the whole subject of law. Our understanding of natural law ever increases with time as truths are shown evidently through time. We see Murray Rothbard as we move forward here, and he had a very deep understanding of natural law. We see also many historians and judges talking about it, notably Germain Grisez, John Finnis, Frank Van Dun. We see the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We see historian Russell Hittinger, European Convention on Human Rights. We see historian Robert George. Let's go through each one, just as we did before. Murray Rothbard states, quote, "The intention is to set forth a social ethic of liberty, i.e., to elaborate the subset of the natural law that develops the concept of natural rights, and that deals with the proper sphere of politics, i.e., with violence and nonviolence as modes of interpersonal relations. In short, to set forth a political philosophy of liberty." He had a relatively deep understanding of natural law, as I stated, very similar to Lysander Spooner. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, quote, "Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person, as well as the fact, quote, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. That, quote, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. And, quote, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media. The European Convention on Human Rights is similar to this. And while these may seem as righteous with our modern understanding of natural law, there exist many contradictions, as with the very existence of government. As its nature is a monopoly on violence, thus violating natural rights, creating rights that don't exist in nature, and as if pieces of paper grant rights, and punishing any individual's disobedience to authority. Freedom is thus not a right under government, constituting a form of slavery. Natural truths cannot be enforced by any government in any way if truth is an already given present condition. Rights of every individual belongs to themselves and must be protected by themselves or others voluntarily or with consent, with knowledge of the self-defense and non-aggression principles. It is an individual's own responsibility to own themselves, their body as their property, as a means of ownership, to exercise their rights, also a form of property, and defend them by all means, even against any government. The historians that I mentioned also previously, other than Murray Rothbard, particularly coined a, quote, new natural law, which has received much criticism for its statist and contradictory views to these other understandings and older understandings of natural law. Now, upon reaching the modern day and age in the 21st century, we have gotten clear with all our definitions of slavery, freedom, truth, all these. And we have a worldwide one great work network, is what it's called, of public teachers who are talking about natural law and occultism as of 2021. And here you can see all the many different teachers involved in this. Notably, you'll notice Mark Passio in the documentary Mark Passio and the Science of Natural Law, or Natural Law, the Real Law of Attraction, in 2013. That was a series of seminars. The documentary was a movie type of format that's about 2 hours long. You see also the Mises Institute of Teachers, founded in 1982. You see the Lew Rockwell Center, which also has a website online, founded in 1999, which debunks old and new views of natural law that legitimize man's law and statism. We see the rise of real anarchism, which is also just living in harmony with reality, recognizing that anarchon means no rulers, which by definition means freedom, because you rule yourself. We see the end in whole of mental slavery when we come to understand this, because it is a mind war since we're battling a belief system known as statism. We see a revival and great understanding of Hermeticism and Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism and simple deism. We see voluntarism, consequentialism. We even see the movement Nature is the Answer, which I myself founded on behalf of sharing more of these ideas. And it is stated that morality is the heart of natural law. In modern Satanism, as it can be readily seen as you go to their websites and read their text, embraces moral relativism, the belief in subjective morality, and the idea that man can become God, among the subjects that natural law is often mistaken as. Mark Passio, the teacher of natural law in the modern day and age, who receives a lot of recognition for the way he presents, among many others, states, quote, "The power that be seek to keep this information hidden from the people of the earth at all costs, because understanding this information about natural law will level the playing field and put an end to the currently entrenched systems of control that are operating on the earth." So as you can see, natural law has gone through hundreds of thousands of philosophers, many unmentioned, to come to where it stands now, where we have mass information at our fingertips for greater knowledge of any law, whether by man or nature, for not just a country's independence, but for an individual's own independence that belongs rightfully for themselves, to be sovereign, not a slave. The call for a new age of enlightenment, a worldwide conscious awakening. There is such a thing as education, which many people may not prefer to partake in, especially when it involves getting past mental barriers and egos. However, it is the only sure reliance for liberty, as quoted by many people, and while it is harder than simply imposing our will on others and forcing compliance through fear of violence, it is the optimal solution to the world's problems, not currently found in any of the world's education systems on purpose, as these systems are often influenced by the government. Just because some of these topics may seem religious does not mean that they are. When they concern simple ethics related to freedom, it constitutes a science, as in fact organized religions have been complicit in the compliance with government and the riddance or ignorance of natural law. A spiritual conscious shift and evolution for humanity is required for the greatest sustainability we are to see in reducing harm in the greatest of manifestations on this earth. Government is the vehicle by which violence, slavery, fear, blind belief, manipulation, power, greed, and all evils become aggregated. And by observing its nature under natural law, its complete contradiction to natural law, we may understand its inherent dangers to society. Slavery was a hardship for many people to get rid of alone, as it was part of society for thousands of years, but that did not mean it was right or natural by any means. It was rid of by education of natural rights, simple ethics essentially, natural law. It was founded upon the very foundation of government, as well when looking at the first forms of government and their hierarchical structures, including, for example, the Sumerian Empire, we see slavery start to arise. It is no coincidence the same arguments made justifying the existence for government are the same for justifying the existence of slavery. Have you ever looked into that? Mental enslavement being the worst, manifesting into physical slavery. If it isn't right for you to do it, what makes it right when government does it? To skip this idea, to not question this idea, is to ignore the natural law we are ever destined to know, to end slavery once and for all in all its forms, to have true freedom. So learn natural law on nita.one/advanced, or just go to nita.one and learn more about this information. That's natureistheanswer.one. Become part of history by sharing these self-evident truths. Thank you for watching Nature is the Answer. I am Cory Edmund Endrulat. Thank you for watching.